Hello everyone and welcome back to this penultimate episode of our series on painting A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. In this series we've been painting the Great John Umber, Ramsay Bolton, and Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain That Rides. This episode is the second last of the series and is a little bit longer because it includes a whole lot of the finishing touches that we put on before our miniatures are ready for the tabletop. Next episode is going to be a pretty quick one as we just finalize the metallic areas and the trim of the bases, but this time around we're going to be doing a whole lot more than that. We are going to touch up the bases with a little bit of our Vallejo cork brown, making sure they're an even brown color, go in with our brown ink to dye that and give it a little bit of depth and a little bit more of a muddy texture. Then we're going to apply some flock, Woodland Scenics flock, which is well, it's basically an artificial grass product to make it look like our bases are grassy. We're going to varnish the miniatures with some matte varnish, and finally we're going to do a little bit of a touch-up to show you how you can touch up even after you have varnished. First of all, we're going to be doing the simple step of taking our Vallejo cork brown, and now that our texture paste has set up and given us a bit of a rocky texture on the bases, we're just going to cover all of that in our cork brown. You don't need to be incredibly thorough here. As long as you get most of the beads covered, the black in shadowy or recessed areas isn't going to stand out that much, and we're going to be letting brown ink flow over the entire base very, very shortly. When that brown ink settles in, it's also going to dim the recesses, it's going to make everything fade together, it'll be fine. So don't get too broken up if you can't quite get your brush's bristles in under a clump of these little textured blocks or balls. Just carry on from there. Put on a reasonably thick amount over top to make sure they're covered, and then go on to the next miniature. This step is really quick, but it is really essential to getting a finished look on the miniature's bases, because the black, the flat sort of glossy black almost that those beads have, obviously stands out a little bit when you're trying to make a natural base. There are a lot of different ways that you might want to do your bases for your miniatures, depending on the environment you're going to have them in. For my set of A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures, I've decided on a convention where all of the non-combat characters have a stony base, sort of an indoors castle, just gray stony kind of thing going on, whereas all of the characters that you would use in combat get a grassy base, representing, a really generic battlefield, basically. As such, what I'm going to be showing here is how to make one of these grassy bases, but if you want to get more creative, absolutely go ahead. There are some great tutorials elsewhere on YouTube to show you how to do different kinds of bases, and I'm going to be trying to put out some videos on different styles of basing at some point in the future. Some ideas for making sort of moon surfaces, as well as refinements to this grassy formula, and how I've ended up doing my stony bases in the future. To be honest, this style of base with the grass on it is the one that I use for 90% of my miniatures right now because it is so generic, it works with pretty much anything. Yes, if your miniatures are going to spend most of their time indoors, if you're making a dungeon delving party, you may not want to make a grassy base like this, and in that case I do recommend you look at either my previous series of videos on painting A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures, where I made a bit of a stony base for Cersei Lannister, or some of my upcoming videos where I'm going to be producing stony bases for some miniatures as well. Those would fit in really well with a dungeon environment and would be great for any sort of delving adventurers you have. Now that we've put the cork brown on there, we're just going to give it a little bit of time to set up, and then we're going to be going in and washing things with our brown ink. In the meantime though, because we have brown ink on our palette, I'm just going to touch up some of the areas that I think should be browner than they are right now. The brown ink from this P.H. Martin set, if you're following along with me with the same equipment, you'll probably have noticed that it gives you a very peculiar brown insofar as it can be a little almost pinkish and faded in some areas, in some concentrations. I haven't gotten a super hold of it, and to be honest, it honestly isn't that much of an issue in most cases, but depending on what colors are adjacent to it, it may not look as deep and brown as you want for that particular miniature. If that's the case, it's really easy to come back at this step. You know you're going to be using brown again later when you're doing the bases. Just come back around and put a little bit more over top. You'll get a deeper color, it'll fill in the shaded areas more, and it will just give you a slightly different color. So, yeah. I'm going to be doing this for a little while here, just making sure that I have covered up all of the areas that I want touched up while letting that cork brown dry, because I'm doing all of this in a single sitting. Feel free to continue watching if you want to see all the areas that I decided to darken the brown on. Otherwise, there is an index in the description where you can just jump to the section where we're actually going to be coloring the bases.
When you decide to go on to washing the bases with the brown ink, you're going to want a pretty copious amount of ink in order to make sure that you are not missing any as you wash them. You're also going to want a broad, loose bristled brush that you can use to absorb a whole lot of that ink and lay it down onto the bases. Don't be shy with this and let the ink do the work. I think you'd be hard pressed to put on too much. If you put on too much, really it's just going to flow off the sides and it's not going to do anything bad. Any ink that you get overspray onto people's boots or something at this point, well, A, we painted most of our boots brown anyway, and B, it'll just look like they're a little dirty or splotchy or something like that. Make sure this goes on thickly though, because the Vallejo cork brown on its own doesn't look that great as an earthy color. It's a little sandy, and with some texture it can look okay, but on its own I'm not a huge fan. It looks really dry and cracked, whereas if you get this wet brown ink over top, it makes a sort of dirtier color, and it does then look like, I don't know, just dried out soil. especially once we've gotten our flock on over top afterwards, it'll look really good. Carry on with this, apply it real thickly, and then after that, we're going to be getting onto the flocking. I mentioned before that if you accidentally get some of this brown ink onto areas you don't want it on, it'll normally just pass off as sort of dirt or wear from the travel. Well, you can just do that on purpose if you want to as well. We have brown ink available, you're doing it all over the base. Go ahead and put some onto characters' feet, or put it onto the hems of their clothes, or wherever you think should be dirtied up from their traveling or battling. For these purposes, you may want to use a smaller brush just to be a little more accurate, and you don't want to go on quite as thickly normally. We don't want it to look quite brown, but getting a little bit of a spackling pattern or looking just a little bit splashed or splattered might be ideal. Feel free to use a little bit of the excess brown that you may have applied to the base to do this. Go around and weather your miniatures up a little bit with this cheap way of weathering, and then we'll be getting on to the flocking itself. Flocking the bases is going to do a lot for your miniatures in two big ways as far as I see it. Number one, it's going to add a little bit to the diorama effect and sort of the inclusion of your miniatures into their own little world by making a grassy effect, you know, that makes it look like they're actually walking in an environment. And number two, it's going to add some real color contrast to the bases that's going to make the miniatures pop out. The static grass flock that I use, the medium green from Woodland Scenics, it might seem a little expensive for little grass fibers, but I've been on the same bottle for years now. So generally speaking, I'd say it's pretty good value as far as a product goes. And also, the medium green is a little dusty green, so it's not necessarily, you're not getting this blend of colors to make this really vibrant grass, but we've only got so much base to play with on most of these guys anyway. What it does do, though, is it makes a green color, which is in contrast with the more earthy tones that we use both for the base and for a lot of these medieval miniatures. But it's also a little dusty and a little lower in saturation, so it doesn't steal the show from them. You don't have this neon light underneath that you want to look at. What it does do, though, is it just accents the miniatures a little bit and gives their color a little bit of variety. I really love the effect you get by putting this flock onto the bases. I didn't flock at first. I tried to make up some alternate ways at home using just green color or something, or just coloring the textured bits green or whatever. It didn't really have the same effect. The flock really does do quite a bit for the way it catches the light and the coloration it adds to your miniature's bases. You'll see what I'm doing here is I've grabbed a bunch of the flock and I'm pinching it between my fingers so that all of the ends are sticking out. This means that as I dab it into the glue that we've just put onto the miniature's bases, a significant amount of that static grass is standing up. It is called static grass because if you have a static grass applicator that puts a static charge onto whatever it is you're applying the grass to, that'll force it to stand vertical and give you a nice diorama effect. And it is really good for diorama makers. If you find some people online who make dioramas or make larger scale models than this, you'll probably find that they use static grass applicators for applying it. On a small area like this, and also on a smaller budget, if you will, you may not find yourself actually in the market for one of those, because to be honest, it's not all that necessary. I've just found that pinching it and tapping it on, or even just sprinkling it on normally, will give you enough of a volume effect on the static grass that it looks fine on the miniature's bases. But of course, you want to step up your game and do it the other way, or you like better how it looks when you do it with the static grass applicator, go ahead. Obviously, the world is your oyster as far as your miniatures are concerned. Apply the static grass in a sort of patchy fashion so that we're not covering up all of that brown that we worked on, but also so that you get enough static grass on there that it doesn't look like just actual patches in a mud field, unless that's what you're going for, I suppose. But for me, I try to get an even distribution of grass and mud, just so that we can see that texture paste that we put on earlier. You can see that it sort of pushes through the grass a little bit. I build my grassy areas around it, and then that way I get a little bit of relief on the textured bases, and they add to the overall look of the miniature quite a lot, in my opinion. Clean up very carefully after this, and try to recover as much of the static grass as you can, because as you're tapping it on, it's going to kind of you're just going to find it'll get a little bit everywhere. To be honest, it's very, very light, and if there's any breeze, it's just going to blow it all over the place. Not least of which is it's going to get blown onto your miniatures. If you've got a very, very broad, very, very soft brush, you could try to tap it away like I'm doing here. But I'd be careful of using any brushes with stiffer bristles, just because they might scuff up the finish on your miniatures. We haven't varnished them yet, so watch out for that. If you are going to varnish with an airbrush, as I do, you will also have the option of using the airbrush's airflow to just blow away any static grass that's loose on the miniatures before you actually start varnishing them. And I do recommend you do that if you have the chance. Otherwise, you could just shake them around, try to pet stuff off with your finger. There's lots of options, but you'll probably want to look into it, just because having little furry bits on the hems of their clothes or on their legs or something like that might not be the look you're looking for in the finished miniature. And if you don't pay attention to it, you'll only notice it once you take them out to play. For my actual varnishing, I use Liquitex matte varnish that I get at Michael's, a local hobby shop in Canada and I believe the United States. Because I can purchase it there with coupons. This Liquitex matte varnish applies very well through an airbrush. I can dust it on very lightly, and it gives me just the matte finish that I'm looking for. If you are looking to use the same materials as me and you don't have access to a Michael's or a store with coupons near you, or you can't find the same items, there are Amazon affiliate links in the description below. If you do make any qualifying purchases through there, I will earn on them, so it's a nice way to support the channel while also getting a little something for yourself so that you can follow along with these tutorials. As you can sort of see, the cone of spray off to the right there is coming in, and I'm just trying to hit them from a reasonable distance away, probably 6 inches to 10 inches, so that the spray is broad enough that I am doing what we call dusting with the airbrush, which is to say I'm not applying it really thickly and up close. I'm trying to very, very loosely get it on, so it makes a very thin layer. If you do knock over a miniature, like I just did there, make sure to inspect it afterwards, because the varnish especially, and just their surfaces, are going to be a little tacky, and they might pick up any dust or spare flock that you have lying around from earlier in this process. I'm trying to do all three at once here, and I'm just turning them 90 degrees every time I do a face to go on to the next one. You could do them individually, and it takes about the same amount of time, I've found, so I don't normally bother with this elaborate setup with the sticky tack and stuff. I find it more reliable to just hold one and spray one at a time. That being said, this also worked fairly well in terms of just being able to, spray from left to right and get all of them in one fell swoop. With the matte varnish, it should be giving you a matte finish, which is to say it shouldn't be glossy anymore. You shouldn't have like a shine on them, which the shine is really the biggest downside for me for the inks on their own. But with the shine cut, you're going to get a really, really nice finish on these miniatures that... honestly, the difference when I first saw it, when I first tried a matte varnish, just I forget why or what inspired me to do it. Probably a YouTube video if I had to guess. But I fired some matte varnish on, and the difference was astounding, and it made this ink washing process just... I mean, it took away the really big downside to it for me. So I hope you try the same thing. If you do try applying it with a brush, or even if with an airbrush, make sure you don't get the varnish on too thickly. If you start seeing that it's glossy on the surface of the miniature, you might be going too far. If it's pooling anywhere, you're going to get cloudy effects, and it's not going to look very good or very even or very smooth. So you want to make sure that you're getting it very, very lightly on all sides of the miniature, and this is easiest to do with an airbrush. Once you've done that, set them aside and give them some time to dry. I think the bottle says something like 6 or 8 hours. I normally give them a full day just because I really don't want to disturb the setting of the varnish, and your atmospherics, like the humidity in your local area and stuff, can really impact how it finishes off. Now you see, I just noticed that there's an area on top of Gregor Clegane that is missing a bit of finish, a bit of its black coloring. Well, as I just pointed out, our Mod Podge matte glue is in fact a matte glue, so it serves well as a matte medium for our ink. By putting a little bit of this matte glue in with some black ink, I'm going to be able to apply that black over top of the area that was missed and that we see the primer through on top of Gregor Clegane's helm, and it's going to dry to a mostly matte finish. It won't be quite as perfect as when you applied the varnish over top, but if you do need to do a spot correction on your miniature, this is a really quick and easy way to do it. Just mix in that matte glue, and you'll see it'll probably turn a little grayer than you'd like. You'll think, oh, I want a black, but it's turning gray because the white's mixing in. The matte Mod Podge actually dries mostly translucent, so that white effect isn't going to be very visible once it dries up at all. Just touch it on to wherever you want it to go. I haven't tried this over a very wide area yet, but for very small areas, it's basically unnoticeable if you do use matte Mod Podge as a medium for another color. So I strongly recommend doing this after you give them the old look over. And you can already see that matte varnish has taken effect on these miniatures. They're looking great. The next episode is going to be the last episode of this series. Then I'm going to be summing up the series in some, more concise formats, again, as I've been doing for the previous series. Tune in next time to come in and see how we do the black liner around the bases. It's not that hard. And also how we do the metallic areas on the miniatures themselves. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned something. If you got any comments or questions, throw them down in the comment section. I'd love to see them. And thank you again for coming back and watching these videos. It means a lot to me that I'm able to help people with these videos or entertain them or whatever it is. Anyway, with all that being said, go play some games.